Acknowledging NARA and the NHPRC. And there we go. And we are in week 5. And I also cannot believe that we have gotten through 5 weeks of this. I am not really sure what I'm going to do with myself on Wednesday mornings after this, but I'm probably going to figure that out. So today's topic is we're going to talk about a little bit about how it went, and I'm going to try to get a sense from you all of if you've done any of the planning and how that process went for you. And we're going to spend the rest of the time talking a little bit about emergency response, because it's great to have all the preparedness stuff done. It's also a really good idea to just have an idea of some of the basics of what response is like. So when you have to do it, you're ready. So that's what most of this week will be. So by the end of today, hopefully we will answer any lingering questions you have about the planning process. And hopefully you will walk out of here with a plan to complete what you need to complete. You will know how to enter a building safely and respond to an emergency. And we'll spend the last few minutes just looking at some of the resources available to you as you move forward. Because I think I've said this before, it's a heavily documented field. So whatever answers you're looking for, there is probably something out there for you. So today's agenda, about the same as usual, a recap of last week, and we'll talk about how it went, safety in emergency response. We'll talk about assessing the damage. We'll talk about some salvage techniques that are particularly useful for archival collections. I'm not going to do every salvage technique for every type of material out there, but since we are archives, I bet you'd like to know how to salvage paper and photographs for starters, and resources. So what did we do last week? Last week we talked about procedures and how you needed to have procedures for everything that you identified as a possible or probable emergency for your institution. And we talked about the fact that you didn't have to reinvent the wheel to do that. I told you that California Preservation has a really good set of procedures that you can steal from and tweak to whatever you need. We talked about writing the plan and all of the components that go into it and all of the attachments that you need to create. And we talked about all the different emergency supplies that you might need, because there are so many things you could buy. And we talked about a little bit about the fact that you can talk to the managers of the big box stores in your neighborhood and see if they'll be donated. We talked about getting together with people in your general area and doing some cooperative supply purchasing. And we talked about storing supplies in trash cans near your collection so they were there when you need them. And then we also talked about implementing the plan and how you need to train your staff to use the plan. And we talked about how you need to keep your plan updated, how a plan that hasn't been updated in 10 years is not a useful plan. And I think that's where we left it. So what I want to talk about first is our how did it go? And as we go through, as always, if you have questions, you can type them in the question box and we will get those answered for you, either during class or at the end of class, depending on when I see it and when makes sense. But I wanted to start out today by asking you how it went. Is your plan done? Is your plan almost done? If you've been following along with the homework, you should be really close to done with your plan and have a plan for implementing it. So my question for you right now is, what questions do you have at this point about the planning process, about what you need to do to implement the plan? And I'm just going to give a second to see if some questions show up in the question and answer box. I did not hear from anybody over the week with the questions they wanted addressed in the presentation. So maybe nobody has any questions, and if that's the case, it is fine. Let's see. Oh, Nicole has a question. Any advice for getting buy-in from the administration? That can be a tricky question, because I think to a lot of us, it seems so natural that an emergency plan should be part of your preservation planning, and it's an important and necessary document. One thing, I don't know if it'll help or not, but I will throw it out there, is that in the museum world, the American Alliance for Museums has set up something that they call their 5 core documents that any museum should have. And an emergency plan is one of their 5 core documents, along with like a collections policy and an ethics policy, which is not precisely analogous to archives, but it's useful. Excuse me. If you are having trouble getting buy-in from your administration, perhaps one of the strategies you can use is figure out who some of your stakeholders are that might have more influence with your administration than you do, and ask them to see if they will intervene on your behalf. And I would ask what the objections are to creating an emergency plan so that I could counter them logically and rationally. And I would also just keep asking again and again, if you can compile a bit of an emergency history, that might be useful, and say, look, we've had all of these things happen and we could do so much better at preparing for this. And you could also show them horror stories from other people's experiences to talk about why an emergency plan matters, especially if you can show some successful recoveries. So off the top of my head, those are some thoughts. And if anybody else has thoughts, you are more than welcome to put them into either the chat or the Q&As. And Eve says, if you are part of a college, not just a museum, expect them to move slowly if it's not a life or death emergency. Yes, the wheels of bureaucracy turn very, very, very slowly. You reported a mold infestation in the library in July and they didn't send in the remediation team until November. That is terrifying to me, Eve. I am really sorry to hear that. And I hope you didn't lose any collections. And I guess, oh, getting back to Nicole's question, reminding people of the monetary value of collections that you have assembled, and the importance of protecting that is another in. Yes, they will move very slowly. I am astounded that it took that long to deal with the mold infestation, and I am so sorry to hear it. And Eve says, extremely bad, you lost 1,100 books. Wow. man, that even for a bureaucracy, that feels incredibly unresponsive and irresponsible. So I'm sorry to hear that. And Eve, I will throw this out to you. And actually, I'll throw it out to anybody that from time to time, if when people have trouble getting the results that they need from their administration on things like that mold, I am willing to talk to you, get a sense of what the problem is, why it's a problem, and then write a strongly worded letter with my, using my sort of leverage as a quote unquote expert that you can use to bolster your case. So if that happens to you again, Eve, don't hesitate to get in touch. And it might not help, but I am very happy to write a letter saying you're going to lose more money, you have a huge financial investment, plus it's the health of your staff, and this is bad, and you should listen to me because I'm important. I'm not important, just in case you thought I really believed I was, but I do have some credentials that I can throw around. So I don't see any other questions coming in. So do you all mind if I ask you some questions? Because I have some questions for you all. I want to just get a sense of how this is going for everyone. So my first question is, have you created an emergency team? This is completely anonymous, so I can only see aggregated numbers. I can't see who's saying what. So but I think it's useful for me to know, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So for those of you who have created a team, I am very excited for you. For those of you who are at the not yet but soon phase, I would encourage you to figure out what that timetable looks like. And for those of you who are at the no phase, I am sorry to hear it, and I hope that you will be able to soon. But also I know that these things take time to sometimes get in progress. So don't feel like you're being shamed, because just by the fact that you are being here, I know that this matters to you. And there are oftentimes factors beyond your control. Let's see. How about, here is the next one. Have you done the rep worksheets for your building? And this one's a tricky one because I realize that right now, quite a few of you may not have access to your building, which makes it really hard to do those. When we figured out the timing on these webinars, they were originally supposed to be in April, which was a really bad time to do them because everyone was just figuring out how to deal with being closed. But for May and June, we thought that perhaps if people were working from home, this might be a project they could spend some time on if they were looking for projects. But we also realized it would be difficult to do some of the building stuff. So let's close the poll and share the reports. So yeah, I'm not surprised that a comparably smaller percentage have been able to do that, but I am excited about the ones that have. And yeah, and if you haven't yet, you will get to it, I am sure. Pam reminds us that everyone is currently focused on reopening your libraries, and that is absolutely the priority right now. I totally get that. So how much of your plan is finished? And so, yeah, it's about where we're expecting at this point, given the state of the universe. But for the person who is finished, that's amazing. And for the rest of you who are en route, I'm really excited about that any progress has been made. The other thing that I know is that right now it is hard to make progress on things because everyone is having a little hard time focusing. So I've got 2 more questions, I think. 3 more, excuse me. Do you have an implementation plan? Excuse me. Looks like people have stopped voting there. So it'll come. I promise it will come. And do you have any emergency supplies on hand? I am very happy that so many of you have supplies and that those of you who don't have supplies are planning on getting some supplies, because that's one of the really important immediate steps you can take. Just having a few things available will let you do a lot of mitigation very quickly on those minor disasters that are the bulk of the disasters we get. And last question, I promise. So what is your time frame for completing your plan? And so, yeah, so we're seeing the bulk of people are planning on having it done within 2 months. And a few people faster than that. And one person is finished. So I am really happy that there are some plans to do this going forward. And Lisa wants me to reiterate and stress how important it is to have an emergency plan going forward during the pandemic, during and after the crisis, COVID-19 crisis. And yeah, and I would say it's even more important now than ever to have an emergency plan, because you want to know how you're going to be dealing with a crisis so you can deal with it quickly, and so you don't have to have a lot of meetings where you are close to people. You just want to be able to put your plan into action. And your building isn't being probably watched as closely as it is during normal times because you don't have all your staff there all the time. So this is the kind of time when it's more likely that an emergency could happen, and the potential damage is greater because whatever the condition is that is bringing on the emergency could last longer before it's noticed. So thank you, Lisa, for bringing up that really important point. So I think you all can see my slides again. If you can't, would you let me know? It looks like you can, so, and Anne says staff won't even be back. Anne says she's still seeing the questions. So are you seeing my a little bit about emergency response slide now, Anne?
It looks like we can see them.
Oh, great. Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Excellent. So let's move on from planning to response so that you have a little bit of an idea of what that is like. This is a slide from the National Heritage Responders from their response in Puerto Rico. I certainly hope that your responses don't look like this. That is, I believe, my friend Hitoshi down there in his element. And the first thing to talk about is health and safety, because life safety is your first priority. I know we're collections people and we want to talk about our collections, but if you get injured, you aren't able to help your collections. So life safety is the most important thing. Before you respond, first thing to ask yourself is if you are healthy enough. Are you physically healthy? There are some health conditions like high blood pressure that may be exacerbated by PPE. Do you have the physical stamina for long days of hard work? Because it is going to be, you're probably working 12-hour days of heavy labor when you're doing collection salvage response. And then also you want to ask yourself if you are emotionally up to it, because disasters are really difficult times. And especially if you have spent years devoted to a collection and you see you see it irreparably damaged, it's really emotional. And some people are really emotionally great in disasters. Some people are not. It's useful to know yourself and know what you're good at. Some people step up and become leaders. Some people are really fantastic at doing the work if somebody tells them what they need to do. And there are some people who fall to pieces, and the best thing they can do for the response effort is to just go home and deal with their own emotional issues and not get in the way of the response team, because I guarantee if you have a colleague that's falling apart, you're going to be dealing with the colleague and not your collections. And it's not like that's a shamey thing. It's just we want you to be as healthy as possible, and part of that is emotionally healthy as well as physically healthy. You also need to make sure your immunizations are up to date. That's definitely a tetanus shot, and potentially hepatitis A and hepatitis B. And you want to make sure your respirator fit test is current. Oops, sorry. Once you get on site, make sure you know your own limits and know that your own health and safety is your first priority and your first responsibility. If you exhaust yourself or get injured, it makes things worse because everyone has to deal with what you need rather than what your collections need. So don't allow that to happen to yourself. Make sure you take breaks. And make sure you drink lots of water and eat and sleep. All of those things are really, really important. Some general rules of thumb. I like the happy smiling face thumb there. Always work with a buddy. Never be out of visual or audible range of your buddy, so that your buddy can keep an eye on you and you can keep an eye on your buddy in case anything happens. And always make sure someone knows where you are at all times. If you have lots of teams spread out, it's a good idea to schedule meetups and a rendezvous point so that you can keep track of people. And if you do that, make sure that you stick to it, because if you don't show up at your rendezvous point at the appointed time, everyone's going to go looking for you. Wash your hands frequently, even if you're wearing gloves. And if the water is questionable, carry wipes or hand sanitizer. And I'm sure at this point, everyone is very used to carrying hand sanitizer. That's not going to change. And keep your work areas tidy. Make sure there aren't trip hazards, for example, so you don't fall over things. And we can't do this without talking about mold, of course. So with mold, the most important thing to do is to wear your respirator, whether it's an elastomer half mask, or it's a full face respirator, or it's an N95 mask. Make sure you wear your respirator. Lots of people are really sensitive to mold, and you can develop mold sensitivity even if you've never had one after exposure. And I can tell you that because it happened to me. So make sure you wear your respirator. It's a good idea to protect your eyes with non-vented goggles. And it's also a really good idea to cover your hair, particularly if you're someone like me who has a whole lot of hair going on. Mold spores can get caught in your hair, and your hair is close to your face, and it's easy for mold to get from your hair to your eyes and nose. So cover your hair. What I do is when I go to hotels that are fancy enough to have a disposable shower cap, I steal those shower caps and bring them home with me and have them in my emergency kit so that I can cover my hair when I want to. Wear gloves. Take frequent breaks. When I'm wearing a respirator, I tend to take a 5-minute break every hour so I can go take my respirator off, breathe in some non-respiratory air, and just give my face a break. And wash your hands frequently. Even if you're wearing gloves, every time you take your gloves off, wash your hands. If you've had a major disaster, your building may be hazardous. So a big thing to think about is electrical. If the room is flooded, do not enter it unless you're sure the power's off, because we don't want you to get zapped. And be very aware of down power lines. Make sure the building is stable before you enter it. Don't just go into the building if it's been a big enough disaster to damage your building. Make sure that the building has been cleared for you to enter by your first responders. And know that once you enter, the building may be stable now, but the situation can change. So be aware of instability, like maybe teetering shelving perhaps, and leave if you hear shifting or some kind of a noise that indicates that your building is moving. You also want to be careful about fire. If your fire protection is impaired for some reason, have some kind of a fire watch in place so that you can notify the authorities if any kind of a fire starts. So Now that everyone's terrified of getting into your building, we can move on. But not before we look and say, Eve says, don't forget to clean your phone. Yes, correct. Phones are germy, disgusting things. So clean your phone frequently too. And if you're wearing gloves, you probably don't want to be touching your phones. I don't know if you all are like me, that when you go to the grocery store and you see somebody using their phone while they're wearing gloves and you just want to walk up to them and go, what is wrong with you? That's a terrible idea. I don't, because I don't want them to be mad at me. But yeah, keep your phone in your pocket in those situations. And also your shoes. Yep, shoes are also gross and disgusting. And if you're on site in an emergency, you should probably be wearing, if you're not wearing rubber boots to protect you from shock, you want to be wearing like steel-toed hiking boot kind of thing, something really sturdy to protect your feet. So after your disaster, but before you can get in, you may not be able to get into your building immediately. That doesn't mean there aren't things you should be doing. That was a complicated sentence. I am sorry. There are still things you should be doing, even if you can't access your building. This is when you start making your first calls. So obviously your first responders, if you haven't already called them and you need them. And you call your emergency team and get them on the case. And call your disaster recovery vendor if you have one and if you need them. Although most disaster recovery vendors assure me that if it's a disaster that's of a scale that you need them, they will be there before you can make the call. If you have some kind of an external communication plan, like updating your website and your social media, go ahead and implement that. And also get your staff on board and let your staff know what's going on. And then you can establish a command center, which is the place you're going to manage your response operation from. If your building is very damaged, you may not want to do it inside your building. Oftentimes, a nearby parking lot is convenient because it's close, there's lots of space, you may be able to run some power lines from somewhere so you have some power. If you are outdoors, you'll probably want tents, and you'll also probably want laptop computers. Let's see. Oh, I have a couple more questions. Mefrenon says, if I need my phone when I need gloves, I keep the phone in a plastic bag. Oh, that's a clever idea. That's a very good idea. Yep, you can put your phone in a plastic bag and still use the phone and get rid of the, and then take it out of the bag and it's still clean. And Denise says, after mold remediation, the floor tiles are removed, but the adhesive is exposed. Is that considered a hazard to walk on? That is a really interesting question, and I have never gotten that question before. What I would say is my first question would be, is the adhesive sticky? If the adhesive is sticky, I would not want to walk on it. If the adhesive is not sticky and it's just like, old adhesive that's dried, I wouldn't say, I would think it's not any more hazardous to walk on than just walking on the floor in a moldy room. So you don't want to like love the bottom of your shoes afterwards, but it's not overly hazardous. You might want to wipe your shoes down when you get done with it. Ew, it's sticky. I would not want to walk on that then. And mostly just because it's sticky and it would kill my shoes. Again, I really don't think it would be that much more dangerous than walking on the floor, but I don't like the idea of people tracking through sticky adhesive and then tracking that adhesive out of the room with the adhesive and getting that sticky on the rest of your floor. I hope they're putting down new tile for you. Okay, back to your pre-entry. Other things you can do, you can gather information as it becomes available. Establish your financial procedures and resources, figure out how you're going to get the money. You can send people to the store for supplies. Reach out to your resource organizations. This is when you call your National Heritage responders, you call Texas Sarah, you call THRAB and see if they know if they have anything to tell you, and just kind of begin planning for assessment, salvage, and recovery. And finally, you get to re-enter. This is a photo of the young people who went to Florence during the 1966 flood, the Mud Angels, in Florence. Yeah, the beginning of modern conservation and emergency response. So, assuming you can get into the building immediately, what you're going to do is call your first responders, activate your disaster team if there's collection damage. Make sure that everyone is safe and accounted for. That is crucial. You can cut off your building utilities if you need to. If there is standing water, for example, you may want to cut off your power. If there's been anything happen to compromise the security of your building and your collections, you want to make provisions to mitigate that, whether it's boarding up windows or putting in extra security patrols, whatever you need to have happen there. And you need to call your institutional contacts and do all your other communication stuff. As far as tips for reentry, of course, safety first. Always think about safety and make sure you have your tetanus shot. They expire every 10 years. So if it's been 10 years, just go get one. It's not going to be fun, but it's going to make you much safer just for your life in general. Make sure you're wearing appropriate safety gear, like your respirator, like gloves, like a hard hat, like heavy shoes or work boots. Don't work alone. Never go into your building unless your first responders have given you permission. It is not worth getting arrested. It is not worth risking your life. Make sure the first responders have said it's okay. And when you go in, be aware of your surroundings and look for hazards and report them so they can be fixed. That might be things like sparks, broken or frayed wires, structural damage. I've seen some great photos of water pouring out of electrical outlets. I would want to report that and get that dealt with very quickly. And finally, you can begin the assessment process. So you have permission from your first responders. You also want to have permission from your insurance agent because they may want to go in with you to help do the assessment and document the damage. When you go in, you are not going in to fix things. You are going in quickly to assess the damage and then come back out to meet with your team and make a plan. So you go in a team of 2 or 3. There is one person to point out the damage, one person to record the damage, and one person to photograph the damage. And the pointer and the photographer can be the same person if you like, but 2 or 3 people. And even though everything in your soul probably tells you that you would like to touch things and start picking things up, you are not going to touch anything. This is just an assessment. It is not fixing. So you're going to go in, you're not going to touch things. When you go in, you're going to bring and hopefully these are all things you have in your milk crate of personal supplies. You're going to bring a clipboard with plenty of paper and copies of your floor plan so that you can make notes. The Field Guide to Emergency Response also has a helpful assessment form, and I think I included that assessment form in your handout packet for this week. that you can make copies of. You also want pencils. If it were me, I would tie my pencil to my clipboard with a string, because if I've got 6 inches of nasty water on the ground and I drop my pencil, I do not want to be digging through that water trying to find my pencil. So tie your pencil to the clipboard with a string. And I would just use a mechanical pencil. They're cheap and don't require as much maintenance as traditional pencils. A camera, any kind of a camera, digital, disposable, your iPhone, whatever, as long as it has a flash. Because if you don't have power, you aren't able to take pictures without a flash. So flash. And you are asking yourself 3 questions. The first question is, how much material has been affected? Because that's going to affect whether you do the salvage yourself or whether you contract with a vendor. If it's a small disaster and it's 50 books, that might be you. But if it is a large sewage flood, then you don't want to do that. You want to hire someone else to do that for you. You're also going to ask what kind of damage has occurred. Again, if it's water or mud, if it's a small disaster, you may be able to deal with it. But for fire and sewage, you're going to want to contact professionals primarily because of the health hazards. We don't want you breathing in a lot of ash and soot and stuff like that. And we definitely don't want you dealing with the germs involved with sewage. And then you're going to ask yourself what kind of material has been affected, because that's going to help you match that up against your salvage priorities. And it's going to affect the salvage procedures that you need to plan for. Once you've done your assessment, the most important thing to do is stabilize your environment. And by that, I mean identifying and repairing structural hazards so that people can be in there safely. That might include bringing in some scaffolding to prop up things. It might include cutting off the power, turning on power, things like that. You want to reduce your temperature and your relative humidity, because that's going to reduce the chance of mold growth. The ideal is to get lower than 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% relative humidity, but that may not be attainable, particularly if you have no power. But that gives you a goal, and that's not something we should be mistaking for a preservation environment. That's just, we want to keep mold from growing as much as we possibly can. And once you get to that 70-45, remember that things change. So check frequently to make sure your humidity doesn't drift. Things you can do to reduce relative humidity: you can bring in fans. If you're bringing fans in, don't aim them at your collection material, which are going to be delicate. Instead, aim them at the walls, aim them at the ceiling, but keep the air moving around. Turn your air conditioning on as much as you possibly can, if that's a possibility. If you have windows that can be open and it's less humid outside than it is inside, open the windows and open doors. You will never hear a conservator say open the windows, but this is the time you can open the windows. And if you have standing water, you can remove the standing water with a sump pump, with push brooms, or you can hire professionals to get the standing water out for you. And don't just get like standing water. If you have carpeting and furniture that's gotten wet, those hold a lot of water. Get the carpeting out. Come on, you know you've wanted new carpeting or to get rid of your carpeting anyhow. Here's your chance. And get your furniture out, because it's just going to put more and more water into your atmosphere as it dries out. And if you can't reduce the humidity, consider the option of moving the collection. Is there somewhere else safe with better environment that you could put it? Is that a feasible option? And finally, after all of that, you are ready to begin to do salvage. It takes a while. So for salvage, some general rules of thumb. Ideally, because mold grows as early as 48 hours after your relative humidity spikes, the ideal is to air dry or freeze things within 48 hours. This handy little thing that you see a picture of is the disaster wheel. And I would be willing to bet if I had a poll asking you all if you'd seen the disaster wheel, a lot of you would have seen it. But if you don't know the disaster wheel, it is a really handy tool. You can buy them from the American Institute for Conservation. I think they're 12 bucks, maybe they're 10 if you buy in bulk. And they usually have a sale during May. And on the front side of it, it tells you all the steps for dealing with a disaster. On the back side of it, it has salvage procedures for any kind of material you can imagine in a cultural heritage collection. So it'll have paper, but it'll also have things like biological samples preserved in formaldehyde. So that's a great quick reference. Also in your resources, you'll see the salvage at a glance chart. I didn't print it out, but it is like 10 or 15 pages of information on every kind of material you could hope to find in much more detail. And it tells you priorities for that thing and how long you have and pack out advice and salvage advice. Super useful, and it's particularly good in the archival space. And we talked last week about having drills and doing a wet salvage drill. I believe firmly that it is a good idea to do a wet salvage drill before you have your disaster, so you know what wet things feel like. It's very different. So there's some questions you're going to ask yourself. The first question's about salvage. Salvage is incredibly labor intensive, so you have to consider how much help you have available when you're making salvage decisions. And you also have to consider who are going to do the work, right? So your staff are obviously your first line of defense, but your key staff may be on vacation, so they may not be available. And it may be a very emotional experience for your staff, which will make it more difficult. And if it's a widespread disaster, your staff may not be available because if the hurricane takes out your archives and their house, they're probably dealing with their house and their family first. So you want to think about that kind of a thing. Volunteers, if it's a large-scale disaster, volunteers may show up and want to help. People are really connected to their cultural heritage institutions. But a couple things to think about with volunteers. First, there may be liability issues. So you want to consult with your legal counsel before saying, yes, we want volunteers. Second, remember that your volunteers don't have any training. So someone is going to have to train and supervise them. And you have to decide if the amount of time and supervision that's going to go into those volunteers is going to be enough to justify the amount of work you're getting out of them. If you're spending so much time training and supervising for minimal return on your investment, you may not want volunteers. However, there are things volunteers can do. If you're sending things and you need things in freezers immediately, they may be able to help with that. Also, they can donate supplies and money. And that volunteer who goes to Starbucks and gets the traveler of coffee, or goes to Krispy Kreme or Dunkin' Donuts and brings a couple dozen donuts by, that volunteer will be a very, very favorite person. Because we don't want to make people feel unwelcome. We just also want to keep them safe and keep our collection safe and the process moving. You might if it's a major disaster, you may also be involving your external disaster recovery vendors. And we talked a lot, probably 2 weeks ago, about making sure that you have that contract in place. So again, 48 hours before mold begins to grow. So your first priority should be getting things into freezers quickly, unless they are things that should not be frozen. And things that shouldn't be frozen include glass and metal primarily. Most things that we think of as traditionally archival do pretty well in freezers, although definitely not things like glass plate negatives. Please don't put those in freezers. And hopefully you have worked out your salvage priorities, so you can work on your highest priority collections first and work your way through that list. Use fans to keep air circulating. And if you need them, call your conservators, call the National Heritage responders, call the conservators you've identified for advice and for help. Other things, you need to keep records of what is salvaged and what is saved. Otherwise, trying to update your inventories and finding aids will be a nightmare. But also, if you are expecting to get FEMA money to help with your collections, you need to have proof of what you own, which are your inventories and finding aids and accession registers and all of that stuff. And you need to have proof of what was lost, which are your records of what you've salvaged and what you do not salvage. Because there will be some things you throw away, I can promise you. Remember way back in week 1 when we talked about the incident command structure? This is hearkening back to that. You need somebody to direct all of the actions of the team. And you also need a safety coordinator to monitor your staff and make sure they are being safe when they are working. So, salvage procedures. Freezing wet materials. Freezing does not solve your problem, but freezing does put the problem on hold. And freezing is something that you can do in a home freezer, although obviously it's not the most efficient way to do it. And also, you probably don't want to freeze things that are disgusting in the same freezer with your popsicles and lean cuisines and stuff like that. But you can do it in a home freezer. Things that freeze really, really well include books and paper and photos and textiles. And you can wrap them up using freezer paper, put them in plastic bags, and put them in the freezer. If you leave things in the freezer long enough, the water actually will evaporate. It won't evaporate. It will sublimate, which means the water will go from frozen to gaseous without passing through the liquid state. It's kind of like giving your books or your papers freezer burn in a beneficial way. So know that what you put things in, what they look like when you put them in is what they'll look like coming back out. So if you're freezing things, take the time, if you're going to let them stay in there till the water sublimates out, take the time to really tidy them up, make sure that you have things that are, stacks that are square, books that aren't out of alignment. That'll help. If you have large quantities of wet materials, the best thing you can do is vacuum freeze drying, which is something that requires specialized equipment. You're going to hire someone to do it. It's usually your emergency response company will make it happen. And what they do is they take your collection, pack it out, put it in a giant freezer and pull a vacuum on it. And that vacuum will then force the moisture in your books to sublimate out. So they dry much more quickly than just letting it sublimate in your freezer for 2 years. This has a really good track record of success for paper materials. So for large disasters, it is one of the primary recovery methods. And, oh, and I should say, go back to that slide. Again, what things go in looking like with vacuum freeze drying is what they come out looking like. So when you're packing out, make sure to tidy up your books, tidy up the corners, make sure that stacks are square and even with maybe a little weight on them so that they stay in place, so that they look nice, so they come out looking nice. If anyone tries to sell you vacuum thermal drying, do not let them run screaming because it is not appropriate for heritage collections. It's the same as vacuum freeze drying, except they don't freeze it. They just put wet material in a vacuum and pull the vacuum on it and suck the water out that way. And it results in extreme distortion and blocking of paper. So no vacuum thermal drying. And then we get to air drying, which is what you'll be doing if you have a small disaster. It's what you'll be practicing if you have a drill. It's the classic. It is very inexpensive in terms of materials. It just requires some paper towels. Or I like this photo that you're seeing. They've taken a book cart and strung some string across the top of the cart, across the shelves, put something to line on it, and then clamped strips of negatives to it to dry. That's very clever. It does require lots of time and lots of space. So it's most suitable for small quantities of paper materials. It's also what we do for almost all kinds of artifacts. If you have artifacts, like say you have somebody's desk as part of your archival collections, which is more frequent than you would imagine, you're not going to put that desk in a freezer. You're just going to air dry it. Things will show signs of water damage, and book and paper may require more shelf space, up to 1/3 more. And the other thing to know is that if you have coated materials, air drying is not usually successful for coated materials. Coated paper is that slick, shiny paper that you'll see things like art books printed on, anything that's heavily illustrated. It's coated with clay. And that clay coating makes it possible to get really beautiful printing, but also the clay melts. And when it melts, it fuses together. So freezing, vacuum freeze drying is the best way to deal with coated paper. Air drying, you'll get a brick. So air drying techniques for books and paper. Again, keep your coated paper wet until you can vacuum freeze dry it. For books, take paper towels and interleave books with paper towels. What I usually do is put paper towels in several sections, and I line them up so that they're all even with the bottom of my book. And then I can stand the book on end and fan it out. Periodically, I re-interleave. I take the old interleaving that's wet out and put new paper towels in. When I do that, I change the direction so I can flip the book over. If I do that, then the water doesn't pool at one end of the book. Individual sheets, you can just put paper towels or newsprint out on a table and dry them flat. Or you could put up a couple of pieces of fishing line about 4 to 6 inches apart and drape them over the fishing line. I wouldn't do it just over one piece because you'll get basically a fold, but if you do it over a couple of pieces, it works pretty nicely. If you're freezing books, wrap them in freezer paper. And if you're freezing stacks of flat paper, interleave them before you freeze them. For art on paper and framed photographs, framed documents, ideally, you will take things out of the frames. The exception to that is if your art or your framed object is stuck to the glass. If it's stuck to the glass, leave it in the frame because you could do serious damage when you try to remove it from the frame. If you can get things out of their frames, that's awesome. Dry them flat with the image side up. If it's stuck to the glass, leave it in the frame and dry it with the glass side down so that when it dries, gravity won't pull your object off of that glass and leave a big chunk of the surface of your object stuck to the glass. Glass does not freeze well, so don't put glass in the freezer. And talk to a conservator before you freeze photographs. There are lots of kind of photographs that freeze beautifully. So things like photos that you got printed at the local photo mart, those will freeze beautifully. Silver gelatin prints freeze beautifully. Glass plate negatives don't freeze so beautifully. So talk to a conservator before you freeze your photographs, but a lot of them can get stuck in a freezer and then dealt with later. The other great thing, I don't think I said about freezing, and I should have, is that when you freeze things, you don't have to unfreeze them all at the same time. If you're freezing photographs and you're going to air dry them later, if you have 500 photos in your freezer, you can take out 25 or 30 at a time and deal with a manageable number. Now, here we go. So for photographs, yes, consult a conservator about historic photographs before you freeze them or before you do salvage on them. But for non-historic photos, keep them in clean water up to 48 hours. Take them out of any kind of enclosures they're in. If they're in that the envelope from the Walmart, take them out of that. And they just need to be air dried, either flat or hung up with clothespins. Don't touch your image. That's a rule of thumb for photographs anyhow, but your photographic emulsion is probably going to be a little sticky, so it's going to even be more easy to damage it. And what you're going to see as you air dry photos is they are going to roll up very likely as they dry. And that is fine. The purpose of salvage is not to get things back to perfect. The purpose of salvage is to get things to the point where they are safe and are not going to get moldy, so you can deal with them at a later time. So don't worry if your photos roll up into little tubes, that is fine. Later on, you will consult with a conservator and they will teach you how to humidify and flatten your dried photos. If you're going to freeze photos, you want to interleave them with either wax paper or freezer paper before you freeze them so that they don't stick together. And what you're seeing in the photo on this page is photos from the Wimberley Memorial Day flood, which I guess was, what, like 5 years ago at this point? And what happened there was people were finding photos washed up in the streets and they just brought them into the public library. for people to claim them. But you'll see there were photos that were submerged for a long time, and it's all just, you know, Walmart prints. And you can see that the layers of the emulsion are beginning to bleed and swirl and decompose a little bit. But even when that happens, on a lot of these, some of that is happening, but there's still recoverable image, so it's worth recovering that image. And hopefully you have your salvage priorities in line so that you can decide, maybe I don't need to salvage every single one of these Walmart photos of events we had at the archives where we don't know all the people. We can throw those away and be happy about it. Remember, your goal is to keep things from growing mold so they can be conserved or digitized later. So it's good that I have an actual slide for that instead of just saying it. Donna says, what about when you're working with scrapbooks with photos and news clippings glued to awful acidic paper? Nightmare. When you are dealing with something like that, what I would want to do is, okay, most scrapbooks on that acidic paper are single sheets that have been punched in the sides and are held together with either screw posts or some kind of a tie. And I would remove that fastener and take the sheets apart, if you can take them apart, and dry them flat individually. That, I think, is your best bet for salvaging them. But that's also something that if you get into that situation, it's definitely worth contacting a conservator. Call my friends at the National Heritage Responders. There are a couple people who would be really into talking with you about that. All righty, so, and that is an excellent question. Thank you. So here we are in the home stretch, y'all. And I thought we would just take a quick review of a bunch of the resources that are out there and are available to you as you go through this process. So we looked at several templates. We looked at D-Plan, and we looked at the Pocket Response Plan, and we looked at the California Preservation Program Plan. And all of these resources are also on the resource list attached to your packet with handy dandy web links so that you should be able to just download it and click out, but otherwise you can copy and paste. The California Preservation Program has a lot of really useful emergency response stuff beyond just the template and the procedures, so have a look at that. The WAC Salvage at a Glance chart is the most comprehensive salvage reference out there. So it is completely worth downloading. I believe it is available as a National Park Service Conserve-O-Gram, but it's also available from Conservation Online. And the National Park Service Conserve-O-Grams also have some general good emergency response information. I'm a big fan. The American Institute for Conservation has a health and safety emergency response wiki that's quite well developed. So if you want to learn things about what kinds of wildlife show up after emergencies and how you should use a long stick when you are walking in water to scare away any snakes before you walk through them, that is a useful thing to know about. But also, they go into huge amounts of detail on PPE and on what kind of hazards you can expect to find. I talk a lot about the snakes because I think that's really fascinating, but it's more than just the snakes. And we talked the first week about the FEMA Incident Command Training. and how useful that is. We also talked about the Field Guide to Emergency Response and how it's a print publication that is very useful. One thing that goes along with that I don't think I have on there, but the American Institute for Conservation has a very good YouTube channel, and one of the things they have on their YouTube channel are videos of salvage techniques for all kinds of objects that were originally developed to be a DVD that went with the Field Guide to Emergency Response, but DVDs are not the most current technology. You probably don't have a DVD player on your computer anymore, so they just put it all on their YouTube channel, and they're really nice and detailed. Oh, Annie wants to know, what do I mean by keeping coated paper wet until you can treat it? Annie, just if you have material with coated paper, take a trash can, a plastic trash can, and fill it with clean water and put the coated paper in that until you're ready to freeze it. And Pam wants to know if all the handouts will be available because she's missing the first two. And Peggy, I believe you have figured out a way to make those available.
Yes, they are on the THRAB.org website under professional development. There's links to all of the recordings and the handouts.
Awesome, thank you, Peggy.
Sure.
And yeah, so the NEDCC preservation leaflets, probably most of you know about them, but they have some good basic emergency response. And we talked about connecting to collections care, which has all of the free webinars you could possibly want to watch, and the YouTube channel. And with that, oh my goodness, I have gotten through all of the material I have prepared for the entire 5 weeks. So what questions do you have? I'm going to give it a few more seconds for questions to come up. Dana says, thank you. Dana, thank you for being here. I am very excited that we've had so many people show up for so much of this. It is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, so I am very excited when people show up. And how long will the handouts be on the website? I believe indefinitely, but that's a Peggy question as well.
Yes, I plan on making them available on the website indefinitely.
Excellent. And Eve says, not a question, but it's important information. If you're exposed to mold, know all the symptoms before you go to the doctor. Absolutely, and know what you're dealing with. And Pam says the biggest issue is getting everyone on board. Yeah, it is not, disaster emergency planning is not like the sexy museum, archive, library topic, which is unfortunate because it is super important. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Phyllis. And so this isn't really homework at this point, right? Because I'm not going to ask you what happened. But from my perspective, what you need to finish is finish writing your plan and get your team trained and keep the plan updated. And the only other note I had here was that it is absolutely okay to share this homework with your team. That is the point of having a team. Important thing to get it done. Oh, we have one more question from Nicole. What's the best way to get involved? So to get involved or sign up as a volunteer as we move into hurricane season? What I would do, Nicole, right now is reach out to Texas Sarah. I don't know what their procedures are for getting involved, but I think that's where you would have the easiest path in, because the National Heritage Responders is working on figuring out how to expand their team, but we're not quite there yet. The other thing that you can do, right, Texas Sarah is all Texas, but it would be very useful, and I don't know where you are. I don't know you, so I can't say you're in whatever town, but something else you could do would be, rather than trying to get involved with someone like Texas Sarah, you could get with all of the libraries, museums, and archives in your area and see if you all can make a plan to work together to help each other. That might be one of the most useful things that you can do. But otherwise, talk to Texas Sarah and see what kind of volunteer opportunities they have available. And keep an eye on the National Heritage Responders. Also keep an eye out, announcements come out for it, and I doubt it will happen in 2020 because of the pandemic. But most years, the Smithsonian puts on something called HEART training, H-E-A-R-T. I can't remember what the acronym is, but yeah, I could guess, but it would be wrong. But their HEART training is a free program where you apply, you get accepted. It's usually in December, and they fly you to December for a week and put you up in a hotel and do a week-long serious emergency. It's primarily response. So a lot of wet salvage, a lot of incident command training. And once you do that, you are really qualified to go out and help other people. Pam says Salvation Army. Yep. Salvation Army, Red Cross. There are lots and lots of emergency response organizations. They may not be working with collections. But I agree. I have been a Red Cross volunteer and they are wonderful. So many good groups. And with that, I feel like everyone has gotten through an awful lot of me talking at them, so I don't feel bad about letting you go 10 minutes early. Remember that there's my email address. Please stay in touch as you move forward. I'm around. I love to get email. I have ideas and thoughts. So really don't hesitate to reach out if I can help you. And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been great. I've learned a lot just kind of lurking here in the background. And I want to remind everyone to fill out the survey when we wrap up and share your thoughts with us so we can provide better professional development opportunities for you in the future. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye.